It came crackling over the hills like an invisible fog. Movement without a body tired it, and it drifted very slowly. It wasn't thinking now. It had been months since it had last thought, because the brain that was doing the thinking for it had died. They always died, so now it was naked again and frightened. It could hide in one of the blobby white creatures that bad nervously as it crawled over the turf, but they had useless brains capable of thinking only about grass and making other things that went by. No, they would not do. It needed something better, a strong mind, a mind with power, and a mind that could keep it safe. It searched. The new boots were all wrong. They were stiff and shiny boots. That was disgraceful. Clean boots was a bit different. There was nothing wrong with putting a bit of polish on boots to keep the wet out. But boots had to work for a living. They shouldn't shine. And Tiffany, aching, standing on the rug in her bedroom, shook her head. She'd have to scuff the things as soon as possible. Then there was a new straw hat with a ribbon on it. She had some doubts about that, too. She tried to look at herself in the mirror, which wasn't easy because the mirror was not much bigger than her hand, uncracked and blotchy. She had to move it around to try and see as much of herself as possible and remember how the bits fitted together. But today, well, she didn't usually do this sort of thing in the house. But it was important to look smart today, and since no one was around, she put the mirror down on the rickety table by the bed and stood in the middle of a threadbare rug, shut her eyes, and said, "See me." And away on the hills, something, a thing with no body and no mind, but a terrible hunger and a bottomless fear, felt the power. It would have sniffed the air if it had a nose. It searched, and it found such a strange mind, like a lot of minds, one inside the other, getting smaller and smaller, strong and close. It changed direction slightly and went a little faster. As it moved, it made a noise like a swarm of flies. The sheep, nervous for a moment about something they couldn't see or smell, bawed and went back to chewing grass. Tiffany opened her eyes. There she was, a few feet away from herself. She could see the back of her own head. Carefully, she moved around the room, not looking down at the her that was moving, because she found that if she did that, then the trick was over. It was quite difficult moving like that, but at last she was in front of herself, looking herself up and down. Brown hair to match brown eyes, well, there was nothing she could do about that. At least her hair was clean and she'd washed her face. She had a new dress on, which improved things a bit. It was so unusual to buy new clothes in the Aching family that, of course, it was bought big so she'd grow into it. But at least it was pale green and it didn't actually touch the floor. With the shiny new boots and the straw hat, she looked like a farmer's daughter, quite respectable, going off to her first job, and that would have to do. From here she could see the pointy hat on her head, but she had to look hard for it. It was like a glint in the air, gone as soon as you saw it. That's why she'd been worried about the new straw hat, but it had simply gone through the pointy hat as if it wasn't there. This was because, in a way, it wasn't. It wasn't visible except in the rain. Sun and wind went straight through, but rain and snow somehow saw it and treated it as if it was real. She'd been given it by the greatest witch in the world, a real witch with a black dress and a black hat and eyes that could go right through you like turpentine goes through a sick sheep. It had been a kind of reward. Tiffany had done magic, serious magic. Before she had done it, she hadn't known that she could, and when she had been doing it, she hadn't known that she was, and after she had done it, she hadn't known how she had, and now she had to learn how. "See me not," she said. The vision of her, or whatever it was, because she wasn't exactly sure about this trick, vanished. It had been a shock the first time she'd done this, but she always found it easy to see herself, at least in her head. All her memories were like little pictures of herself doing things or watching things rather than the view from the two holes in the front of her head. There was a part of her that was always watching her. Miss Tig, another witch, but one who was easier to talk to than the witch who'd given Tiffany the hat, had said that a witch had to know how to stand apart. She'd find out more when her talent grew, so Tiffany supposed the see me was part of this. Sometimes Tiffany thought she ought to talk to Miss Tig about see me. It felt as if she was stepping out of her body, but still had sort of a ghost body that could walk around. It all worked as long as her ghost eyes didn't look down and see that she was just a ghost body. If that happened, some part of her panicked and she found herself back in her solid body immediately. Tiffany had, in the end, decided to keep this to herself. You didn't have to tell a teacher everything. Anyway, it was a good trick for when you didn't have a mirror. Miss Tig was sort of a witch finder. That seemed to be how witchcraft worked. Some witches kept a magical lookout for girls who showed promise and found them an older witch to help them along. They didn't teach you how to do it. They taught you how to know what you were doing. Witches are a bit like cats. They didn't much like one another's company, but they did like to know where all the other witches were, just in case they needed them. And what you might need from them was for them to tell you, as a friend, that you were beginning to cackle. Witches didn't fear much, Miss Tig had said, but what the powerful ones were afraid of, even if they didn't talk about it, was what they called going to the bad. It was too easy to slip into careless little cruelties because you had power and other people hadn't. Too easy to think other people didn't matter much. Too easy to think that ideas like right and wrong didn't apply to you. At the end of that road was you, drooling and cackling to yourself all alone in a gingerbread house, growing warts on your nose. Witches needed to know that other witches were watching them, and that, Tiffany thought, was why the hat was there. She could touch it any time, provided she shut her eyes. It was a kind of reminder. Tiffany. Her mother shouted up the stairs, "Miss Tig is here." Yesterday, Tiffany had said goodbye to Granny Aching. The iron wheels of the old shepherding hut were half buried in the turf high up on the hills. The pot-bellied stove, which still stood lopsided in the grass, was red with rust. The chalk hills were taking them, just like they'd taken the bones of Granny Aching. The rest of the hut had been burned on the day she'd been buried. No shepherd would have dared use it, let alone spend the night there, and Granny Aching had been too big in people's minds and too hard to replace. Night and day, and in all seasons, she was the chalk, its best shepherd, its wisest woman, its memory. It was as if the green downland had a soul. I walked about in old boots and a sacking apron and smoked a foul old pipe and dosed sheep with turpentine. The shepherd said that Granny Aching had kissed the sky blue, and they called the fluffy little white clouds of summer Granny Aching's little lambs. And although they laughed when they said these things, part of them was not joking. No shepherd would have dared presume to live in that hut, no shepherd at all. So they had cut the turf and buried Granny Aching in the chalk and watered the turf afterward to leave no mark and burned her hut. Sheep wool, jolly sailor, tobacco, and turpentine had been the smells of the shepherding hut, and the smell of Granny Aching. Such things have a hold on people that goes right to the heart. Tiffany only had to smell them now to be back there in the warmth and silence and safety of the hut. It was the place she had gone when she was upset, the place she had gone to when she was happy, and Granny Aching would always smile and make tea and say nothing. And nothing bad could happen in the shepherding hut. It was a fort against the world. Even now, after Granny had gone, Tiffany still liked to go up there. Tiffany stood there while the wind blew over the turf and the sheep bells clonked in the distance. "I've got..." She cleared her throat. "I've got to go away. I've got to look proper witching, and there's no one here to teach me. You see, I've got to look after the hills like you did. I can do things, but I don't know things, and Miss Tig says what you don't know can kill you. I want to be as good as you were. I will come back. I will come back soon. I promise I will come back better than when I went." A blue butterfly, blown off course by a gust, settled on Tiffany's shoulder, opened and shut its wings once or twice, and then fluttered away. Granny Aching had never been at home with words, and she collected silence like other people collected string. But she had a way of saying nothing that said it all. Tiffany stayed for a while until her tears had dried, and then she went off back down the hill, leaving the everlasting wind to curl around the wheels and whistle down the chimney of a pot-bellied stove, and life went on. It wasn't unusual for girls as young as Tiffany to go into service. It meant working as a maid somewhere. Traditionally, you started by helping an old lady who lived by herself, and she wouldn't be able to pay much, but since this was your first job, you probably weren't worth much either. In fact, Tiffany practically ran Home Farm's dairy by herself if someone had helped her lift the big milk churns, and her parents had been surprised she wanted to go into service at all. But as Tiffany said, it was something everyone did. You got into the world a little bit, you met new people, and you never knew what it could lead to. That, rather cunningly, got her mother on her side. Her mother's rich aunt had gone off to be a scullery maid, and then a parlor maid, and worked her way up until she was a housekeeper and married to a butler, and they lived in a fine house. It wasn't her fine house, and she only lived in a bit of it, but she was practically a lady. Tiffany did not intend to be a lady. This was all a ruse, anyway, and Miss Tick was in on it. We weren't allowed to charge money for the witching, so all witches did some other job as well. Miss Tick was basically a witch disguised as a teacher. She traveled around with other wandering teachers who went in bands from place to place, teaching anything to anybody in exchange for food and old clothes. It was a good way to get around because people in the chalk country didn't trust witches. They thought they danced around on moonlit nights without their drawers on. Tiffany had made inquiries about this and had been slightly relieved to find out that you didn't have to do this to be a witch, and you could if you wanted to, but only if you were certain where all the nettles, thistles, and hedgehogs were. But if it came to it, people were a bit wary of wandering teachers too. They were said to pinch chickens and steal children away, which was true, and they went from village to village with their gaudy carts and wore long robes with leather patches on the sleeve and strange flat hats, and talked among themselves in some heathen lingo no one could understand, like alia jacta est and quid pro quo. It was quite easy for Miss Tick to lurk among them. Her pointy hat was the stealth version, which looked just like a black straw hat with paper flowers on it until you pressed the secret spring. Over the last year or so, Tiffany's mother had been quite surprised and a little worried at Tiffany's sudden thirst for education, which people in the village thought was a good thing in moderation, but if taken unwisely could lead to restlessness. Then a month ago the message had come, be ready. Miss Tick in her flowery hat had visited the farm and explained to Mr. and Mrs. Aching that an elderly lady up in the mountains had heard of Tiffany's excellent prowess with cheese, and was willing to offer her a post of maid at $4 a month, 1 day off a week, her own bed, and a week's vacation at Hogswatch. Tiffany knew her parents. $3 a month was a bit low, and $5 would be suspiciously high. But prowess with cheese was worth the extra $1, and a bed all to yourself was a very nice perk. Before most of Tiffany's sisters had left home, sleeping 2 sisters to a bed had been normal. It was a good offer. Her parents had been impressed and slightly scared of Miss Tick, but they had been brought up to believe that people who knew more than you and used long words were quite important, so they agreed. Tiffany accidentally heard them discussing it after she had gone to bed that night. It's quite easy to accidentally overhear people talking downstairs if you hold an upturned glass to the floorboards and accidentally put your ear to it. She heard her father say that Tiffany didn't have to go away at all, and she heard her mother say that all girls wondered what there was out there in the world, so it was best to get it out of her system. Besides, she was a very capable girl with a good head on her shoulders. Why, with hard work, there was no reason why one day she couldn't be a servant to someone quite important, like Aunt Hetty had been, and live in a house with an inside privy. Her father said she'd find that scrubbing floors was the same everywhere. Her mother said, well, in that case she'd get bored and come back home. After the year was up, and by the way, what did prowess mean? Superior skill, said Tiffany to herself. They did have an old dictionary in the house, but her mother never opened it because of the sight of all those words upset her. Tiffany had read it all the way through. No one had told her she shouldn't. And that was it. And suddenly here she was, a month later, wrapping her old boots would have been worn by all of her sister before her in a piece of clean rag, and putting them into the second-hand suitcase her mother had bought her, which looked as if it was made of bad cardboard, pressed grape pips mixed with earwax, and had to be held together with string. There were goodbyes. She cried a bit. Her mother cried a lot. Her brother Wentworth cried just as well, just in case he would get a sweet for doing so. Tiffany's father didn't cry, but he gave her a silver dollar and rather gruffly told her to be sure to write home every week, which is a man's way of crying. She said goodbye to the cheeses and the dairy and the sheep in the paddock, and even to Ratbag the cat. And then everyone apart from the cheeses and the cat stood at the gate and waved to her and Miss Tick, well, except for the sheep too, until they'd nearly gone all the way down the chalky white lane to the village. And then there were silence, except for the sound of their boots on the flinty surface, and the endless song of skylarks overhead. It was late August and very hot, and the new boots pinched. I should take them off if I were you, said Miss Tick after a while. Tiffany sat down by the side of the lane and got her old boots out of the case. She didn't bother to ask how Miss Tick knew about the tight new boots, which just paid attention. The old boots, even though she had to wear several pairs of socks with them, were much more comfortable and really easy to walk in. They'd been walking since long before Tiffany was born, and they knew how to do it. And are we going to see any little men today? Miss Tick went on, once they were walking again. I don't know, Miss Tick, said Tiffany. I told them a month ago I was leaving. They're very busy at this time of year, but there's always one or two of them watching me. Miss Tick looked around quickly. I can't see anything or hear anything. No, that's how you can tell they're there, said Tiffany. It's always a bit quieter if they're watching me. But they won't show themselves while you're with me. They're a bit frightened of hags. That's their word for witches, she added quickly, nothing personal. Miss Tick sighed. When I was a little girl, I'd love to see the pixies, she said. I used to put out little saucers of milk. Of course, later on, I realized that wasn't quite the thing to do. No, you should have used strong liquor, said Tiffany. She glanced at the hedge and thought she saw just for a snap a second flash of red hair, and she smiled a little bit nervously. Tiffany had been, if only for a few days, the nearest a human being can be to a queen of the fairies. Admitted she'd been called a Kelda rather than a queen. And the Knack-Knack should only be called fairies to their faces if you were looking for a fight. On the other hand, the Knack-Knack were always looking for the fight, and in a cheerful sort of way. When they had no one to fight, they fought one another. And if one was all by himself, he'd kick his own nose just to keep in practice. Technically had lived in fairyland, but it had been thrown out, probably for being drunk. And now, because you'd ever been there, Kelda, they never forgot you, and they were always there. There was always one somewhere on the farm, or circling on a buzzard high over the chalk downs, and they watched her to help protect her, whether she wanted them to or not. Tiffany had been polite as possible about this. She'd hidden her diary all the way at the back of the drawer and blocked the cracks in the privy with wadded paper, and done her best with the gaps in her bedroom floor, too. They were little men, after all, and she was sure they tried to remain unseen as to not disturb her, but she'd gotten very good at spotting them. They granted wishes, and not the magical fairy tale 3 wishes, the one that always go wrong in the end, but ordinary, everyday ones. The Knack-Knack were immensely strong and fearless and incredibly fast, but they weren't good at understanding what people said often was what they meant. One day in the dairy, Tiffany had said, "I'd wish I had a sharper knife to cut this cheese." And her mother's sharpest knife was quivering the table beside her almost before she got the words out. "I wish this rain would clear up" was probably okay, because the Feagles couldn't do actual magic. But she learned to be careful not to wish for anything that might be achievable by some small, determined, strong and fearless, fast men, who were not also above giving someone a good kicking if they felt like it. Wishes needed thought. She was never likely to say out loud, "I wish that I could marry a handsome prince," but knowing that if you did, you'd probably open the door to find a stunned prince, a tied-up priest, and Nakmak Feegle, grinning cheerfully and ready to act as your best man, definitely made you watch what you say. But they could be helpful in a haphazard way, and she'd taken to leaving out for them things that the family didn't need but might be useful to little people, like tiny mustard spoons and pens and a soup bowl that would make a nice bath for a Feegle, and in any case they didn't get the message. Some soap. And they didn't steal the soap. Her last visit to the ancient burial mound high on the chalk down where the pixies had lived had been to attend the wedding of Rob Anybody, the big man of the clan, and to Gianni of the Long Lake. She was going to be the new Kelda and spend most of the rest of her life in the mound, having babies like a queen bee. Feegles from other clans all turned up for the celebration, because if there's one thing a Feegle likes more than a party, it's a bigger party, and if there's anything better than a bigger party, it's a bigger party with someone else paying for drink. To be honest, Tiffany had felt quite a bit out of place, being 10 times as tall as the next tallest person there. But she'd been treated very well, and Rob Anybody had made a long speech about her, calling our fine big wee young hag before falling face first into the pudding. It had all been very hot and very loud, but she'd joined in the cheer when Jeannie had carried Rob Anybody over a tiny broomstick that had been laid on the floor. Traditionally, both the bride and the groom should jump over the broomstick, but equally traditionally, no self-respecting Feegle would be sober on his wedding day. She had been warned that it would be a good idea to leave then, because of the traditional fight between the bride's clan and the groom's clan, which could take until Friday. Tiffany bowed to Gianni, because that's what hags did, had a good look at her. She was small and sweet and very pretty, and she also had a glint in her eye and a certain proud lift to her chin. Nakmak Feegle girls were very rare, and they grew up knowing that they were going to be Keldas one day, and Tiffany had a definite feeling that Rob Anybody was going to find married life trickier than he thought. She was going to be sorry to leave them, but not terribly sorry. They were nice in a way, but they could, after a while, get on your nerves. And anyway, she was 11 now and had a feeling that after a certain age you shouldn't slide down holes in the ground to talk to little men. Besides, the look that Gianni had given her just for a moment had been pure poison. Tiffany had read its meaning without having to try. Tiffany had been the Kelda of the clan, even if it was for only a short time. She had also been engaged to be married to Rob Anybody, even that had been a sort of political trick. Gianni knew all that, but her look had said, "He is mine, and this place is mine, and I don't want you here. Keep out." A pool of silence followed Tiffany and Miss Tick down the lane, since the usual things that rustle in hedges tended to keep very quiet when the Nakmak Feegle were around. They reached the little village green and sat down to wait for the carrier's cart that just went a bit faster than walking pace and would take 5 hours to get to the village of Two Shirts, where, Tiffany's parents thought, they'd get the big coach that ran all the way to the distant mountains and beyond. Tiffany could actually see the cart coming up the road when she turned and heard the hoofbeats coming across the green. Her heart seemed to leap and sink at the same time, because it was Roland, the Baron's son, on a fine black horse. He leapt down before the horse stopped, and then stood there looking embarrassed. "I see a very fine and interesting example of a big stone over there," said Miss Tick in a sticky, sweet voice. "I'll just go over there and have a look, shall I?" Tiffany could have pinched her for that. "You're going, then," said Roland as Miss Tick hurried away. "Yes," said Tiffany. Roland looked as though he was going to explode with nervousness. "Got this for you," he said. "I had it made by a man over in Yelp." He held out a package wrapped in soft paper. Tiffany took it and put it carefully in her pocket. "Thank you," she said, and dropped a small curtsy. Strictly speaking, that's what you had to do when you met a nobleman, but it just made Roland blush and stutter. "Open it later on," said Roland. "I hope you like it." "Thank you," said Tiffany sweetly. "Here's the cart. You don't want to miss it." "Thank you," said Tiffany, and curtsied again, because the effect it had. It was a little bit cruel, but sometimes you had to be. Anyway, it would be very hard to miss the cart. If you ran very fast, you could easily overtake it. It was so slow that stop never came as a surprise. There were no seats. The carrier went around the villages every other day, picking up packages and sometimes people. You just found a place where you could get comfortable among the boxes of fruits and rolls of cloth. Tiffany sat on the back of the cart, her old boots dangling over the edge. swaying backwards and forwards as the cart lurched away on the rough road. Miss Tick sat behind her, her black dress soon covered in chalk dust to the knee. Tiffany noticed that Roland didn't get back onto his horse until the cart was nearly out of sight, and she knew Miss Tick by now should not be bursting to ask a question, because the witches hate not knowing things, and sure enough, when the village was left behind, Miss Tick said, after a lot of shifting and clearing her throat, "Aren't you going to open it?" "Open what?" asked Tiffany, not looking at her. "He gave you a present," said Miss Tick. "I thought you were examining an interesting stone, Miss Tick," said Tiffany accusingly. "Well, it was only fairly interesting," said Miss Tick, completely unembarrassed. "So, are you?" "I'll wait until later," said Tiffany. She didn't want a discussion about Roland at this point, or really at all. She didn't actually dislike him. She found him in the land of the Queen of Fairies, and had sort of rescued him, although he had been unconscious most of the time. And suddenly meeting with an knack-knack feegle when they're feeling edgy can do that to a person. Of course, without anyone actually lying, everyone at home had come to believe that he'd rescue her. A 9-year-old girl armed with a frying pan couldn't possibly have rescued a 13-year-old boy who had had a sword. Tiffany hadn't minded that. It stopped people from asking too many questions, and she didn't want to answer them, or even know how to, but he had taken to hanging around. She kept accidentally running into him on walks more often than was really possible, and he always seemed to be at the same village event she went to. He was always polite, but she couldn't stand the way he kept looking like a spaniel that had been kicked. Admittedly, and it had took some admitting, he was a lot less of a twit than he had been. On the other hand, there had been a lot of twit to begin with. And then she thought horse, and wondered why, until she realized her eyes had been watching the landscape while her brain stared at the past. "I've never seen that before," said Miss Tick. Tiffany welcomed it as an old friend. The chalk rose out of the plains quite suddenly on this side of the hills, and there was a little valley cupped into the fall of the down. There was a carving in the curve it made. Turf had been cut away in long flowing lines so that the bare chalk made the shape of an animal. "It's the white horse," said Tiffany. "Why do they call it that?" says Miss Tick. Tiffany looked at her. "Because the chalk is white?" Not trying to suggest that Miss Tick was being a little dense. "No, I meant, why do they call it a horse? It doesn't look like a horse. It's just flowing lines." That look good if they're moving, Tiffany thought. Been cut out of the turf way back in the old days, and people said, and by the folks who'd built the stone circles and buried their kin in big earth mounds, and they'd cut out the horse at one end of this little green valley 10 times bigger than a real horse, and if you didn't look at it with your mind right, the wrong shape too. Yet they must have known horses and owned horses and seen them every day, and they weren't stupid people just because they had lived a long time ago. Tiffany had once asked her father about the look of the horse when they came all the way over here for a sheep fair, and he told her what Granny Aching had told him when he was a little boy. He passed on what she said word for word, and Tiffany did the same now. "'Tain't what a horse looks like," said Tiffany. "It's what a horse be." "Oh," said Miss Tick, but because she was a teacher as well as a witch and probably couldn't help herself, she added, "The funny thing is, of course, that officially there is no such thing as a white horse. They're called gray." She had to say that because she was a witch and a teacher, and that's a terrible combination. They want things to be right, they like things to be correct, and if you want to upset a witch, you don't have to mess around with charms and spells. You just have to put her in a room with a picture that's hung slightly crooked and watch her squirm. "Yes, I know," said Tiffany. "This one's white," she added flatly. That quieted Miss Tick down for a while. "I suppose you're upset about leaving the chalk, aren't you?" she said as the cart rattled on. "No. It's okay to be," said Miss Tick. "Thank you, but I'm not really," said Tiffany. "If you want to have a bit of a cry, you don't have to pretend you've got grit in your eye or anything." "I'm all right, actually," said Tiffany. "Honestly, you see, if you bottle that sort of thing up, it can cause terrible damage later on. I'm not bottling, Miss Tick." In fact, Tiffany was a bit surprised at not crying, but she wasn't going to tell Miss Tick that. She left sort of a space in her head to burst into tears in, but she wasn't filling up. Perhaps it was because she wrapped all those feelings and doubts and left them on a hill by the pot-bellied stove. And of course, if you were feeling a bit downcast at the moment, I'm sure you could try to open the present Miss Tick tried. Tell me about Miss Level, Tiffany said quickly. The name and address were all she knew about the lady she was going to stay with, but an address like Miss Level Cottage in the woods near the dead oak tree in Lost Man's Lane high overhang, without leave letters in the old boot by door, sounded promising. Miss Level, yes, said Miss Tick, defeated. Yes, she's not really very old, but she says she'll be happy to have a third pair of hands around the place. You couldn't slip words past Tiffany, not even if you were Miss Tick. So there's someone there already, she said. No, not exactly, said Miss Tick. And she's got 4 arms, said Tiffany. Miss Tick sounded like someone trying to avoid a subject. Miss Tick sighed. It was difficult to talk to someone who paid attention all the time. It put you off. It's best if you wait until you meet her, she said. Anything I tell you will only give you the wrong idea. I'm sure you'll get along with her. She's very good with people, and in her spare time she's a research witch. She keeps bees and goats of milk. A witch, I believe, is very good indeed, owing to homogenized fats. What does a research witch do? Oh, it's a very ancient craft. She tries to find new spells by learning how old ones were really done. You know how that stuff ear of a bat and toe of a frog, they never work, but Miss Level thinks it's because we don't know exactly what kind of frog or which toe. I'm sorry, but I'm not going to help anyone chop up innocent frogs and bats, said Tiffany firmly. Oh no, she never kills any, said Miss Tick hurriedly. She only uses the creatures that have died naturally or been run over or committed suicide. Frogs can get quite depressed at times. The cart rolled on down the white, dusty road until it was long for view. Nothing happened, said the skylarks sang so high up they were invisible. Grass seeds filled the air, and sheep bawed high up on the chalk. And then something came along the road. It moved like a little slow whirlwind, so it could only be seen by the dust it stirred up, and as it went past it made a noise like a swarm of flies. And then it too disappeared down the hill. After a while a voice, low down in the long grass, said, Ach, Cribbins, it's on her tail right enough. A second voice said, Surely the old hag will spot it. What, the teaching hag? She not a proper hag. Yeah, she got the pointy hat on her, all them flowers, big yarn, said the second voice a little bit reproachfully. I've seen it. She presses a wee spring and the point comes out. Oh, aye, Hamish, and I dare say she does the reading and writing well enough, but she doesna ken about stuff that's not in the books, and I'm not showing myself while she's around. She's the kind of a body that write things down about a man. Come on, let's go find the Kilda. Mac McFeal of the Chalk hated writing for all kinds of reasons, but the biggest one was this. Writing stays. It fastens words down. A man can speak his mind, and some nasty wee scuggin will drive it down, and who knows what he'll do with that word. You might as well nail a man's shadow to the wall. Now they had a new Keldon. He brings new ideas, and that's how it's supposed to work. It stopped them from getting too set in their ways, and Keenie Keldagini was from Long Lake Clan up in the mountains, and they did write things down. She didn't see why her husband shouldn't too, and Rob Anybody was finding that Gianni was definitely a Kelda. Sweat was dripping off his forehead. He once fought a wolf all by himself, and he'd cheerfully do it again with his eyes shut and one hand tied behind him rather than do what he was doing now. He'd mastered the first 2 rules alright, now that he understood them. Steal some paper and steal a pencil. Unfortunately, there was more to it than that. Now he held out the stub of a pencil in front of him in both hands and leaned backwards as 2 of his brothers pushed him toward the piece of paper pinned up on the chamber wall. It was an old bill for sheep bells stolen from the farm. The rest of the clan watched in fascinated horror from the galleries around the walls. Maybe I could kind of ease my way into it gently, he protested, as his heels left little grooves in the packed earth floor of the mound. Maybe I could just do one of my cameras or full stop piece. You're a big man, Rob Anybody, and so it's fitting you should be the first to do the right, said Gianni. I cannot have a husband, cannot even write his name. I showed you the letters, did I not? Aye, woman with the nasty loopy bendy things, growled Rob. I do not cross that Q, that's a letter that has it in for a man. That's a letter with a sting, that one. You just hold the pencil on paper, and I'll tell you what marks to make, said Gianni, folding her arms. Aye, but 'tis a bushel of trouble writing, said Rob. A word written on can hang a man. Whist, now stop that. 'Tis easy, snapped Jeanie. Big job babies can do it, and you're full-grown feeble. And writing even goes on saying a man's words after he's dead, said Rob Anybody, waving the pencil as if trying to ward off evil spirits. You cannot tell me that's right. Ah, so you're feared of the letters, is that it? Said Jenny artfully. Ah, that's fine. All big men fear something. Take the pencil from Willie. You cannot ask a man to face his fears. There was a silence in the mound as Daft Willie nervously took the pencil stub from his brother. Every beady eye was turned to rob anybody. His hands opened and shut. He started to breathe heavily, still glaring at the blank paper, and he stuck out his chin. Ah, you hurry woman, Gianni McFeegle, he said. He spat his hands and snatched back the pencil stub from Daft Willie. Give me that tool of perdition, and letters won't know it's hit him. There's my brave lad, said Gianni, as Rob squared up to the paper. Right then, the first letter is an R. It's the one that looks like a fat man walking, remember? The assembled pixies watched Rob Anybody, grunting fiercely with his tongue sticking out of the corner of his mouth, dragging the pencil through curves and lines of the letters. He looked at the Kelda expectantly after each one. That's it, she says, lass, a bonny effort. Rob Anybody stood back and looked critically at the paper. That's it, he asked. Aye, said Gianni, you've written your name, Rob Anybody. Rob stared at the letters again. I'm going to go to prison now, he said. There was a polite cough from behind Gianni. It belonged to the toad. He had no other name, because toads don't go in for names, and despite sinister forces that would have had people think differently, no toad has ever been called Tommy the Toad, for example. It's just not something that happens. This toad had once been a lawyer, a human lawyer. Toads managed without them. He'd been turned into a toad by a fairy godmother who intended to turn him into a frog, but it had been a bit hazy on the difference. Now he lived in a fecal mound where he ate worms and helped them out with the difficult thinking. I've told you, Mr. Anybody, that just having your name written down's no problem at all, he said. There's nothing illegal about the words Rob Anybody, unless, of course, and the toad gave a little legal laugh. It's meant as instruction. None of the fecals laughed. They liked their humour to be a bit funnier. Rob Anybody stared at his very shaking writing. That's my name, aye. Certainly is, Mr. Anybody. And nothing bad happened at all, said Rob. He looked closer. How can you tell it's my name? That'll be the reading side of things, said Gianni. I saw the lettery things make a sound in your head, asked Rob. Exactly so, said Toad. But we thought you'd like to start with more physical aspects of the procedure. Could I not just maybe learn the writing and leave the reading to somebody else? Rob asked without much hope. No, my man's got to do both, said Gianni, folding her arms. When a female fecal does that, there's no hope left. It's a terrible thing for a man when his woman gangs up on him with a toad, said Rob, shaking his head. But when he turned to look at the grubby paper, that was still just a hint of pride in his face. Still, that's a bit my name, he said. Gianni nodded. Just there all by itself, no one on a wanted poster or anything, my name drawn by me. Yes, Rob, said the Kelder. My name under my thumb. No scunner can do anything about it. I've got my name nice and safe. Gianni looked at the toad, who shrugged. It was generally held by those who knew them that most of the brains of the McFeegle clan ended up in the women. Man's a man of some standing when he's got his old name. That way or nobody can touch it, said Rob Anybody. That's serious magic, that is. The R is the wrong way round, and you left the A and the Y out of anybody, said Gianni, because it's a wife's job to stop her husband actually exploding with pride. Woman, I do not care whether the Patman was walking, said Rob, airily waving a hand. You cannot trust a fat man. That's the kind of thing us natural writing folks knows about. One day he might walk this way, another day he might walk it that way. He beamed at his name. And I reckon you got it wrong with him once, he went on. I reckon it'd be N-E-B-O-D. That's E-N-E-Bordy. See, that's sense. He stuck the pencil in his hair and gave her a defiant look. Gianni sighed. She'd grown up with 700 brothers and knew how they thought, which was often quite fast while being totally in the wrong direction. And if they couldn't bend their thinking around the world, they usually bent the world around their thinking. Usually her mother had told her it was best not to argue. Actually, only half-done fagels in the Long Lake clan could really read and write. They were considered odd and strange hobbies. After all, when you got on the bed in the morning, what were they good for? The wind couldn't be read and you couldn't ride on water, but things written down lasted. They were the voices of the fagels who'd died long ago, who'd seen strange things, who made strange discoveries. And whether you approved of that, depended on how creepy you thought it was. The Long Lake clan approved, and Gianni wanted the best for her new clan too. It wasn't easy being a new Kelda. You came to a new clan with only a few of your brothers as bodyguards, where you married a husband and ended up with hundreds of brothers-in-laws. Could be troubling if you let your mind dwell on it. At least back on the island in Longleat, she had never had her mother to talk to, but Akelda never went home again. Akelda was all alone. Jenny was homesick and lonely and frightened of the future, which is why she was about to get things wrong. Rob. Hamish and Binyan came tumbling through a fake rabbit hole that was the entrance to the mound. Rob anybody glared at him. We was engaged in a literary enterprise, he said. Yeah, Rob, but we watched the big wee young hag save away, like you said, but there's a hiver after her. Hamish blurted out. Are you sure? Said Rob, dropping his pencil. I never heard of one of them in this world. Oh, aye, said Big Jan. It's buzzin' fair made my teeth ache. So did you not tell her your deputy? There was another hag with her, Rob, said Big Jan. Educating hag. Mystic, said the toad. Aye, the one with a face like a yard of yogurt, said Big Jan. And he said you was not to show herself, Bob. Aye, well, this is a bit different, Rob anybody began, but stopped. He hadn't been a husband for very long, but upon marriage, men get a whole lot of extra sense bolted into their brain. And one is that to tell a man that he's suddenly neck deep in real trouble. Jeannie was tapping her foot and her arms were still folded. She had the special smile women learn about when they marry too, which seems to say, yes, you're in big trouble. But please, dig yourself in any more deeply. What's this about the big wee hag, she said. Her voice as small and meek as a mouse trained at the Roden College of Assassins. Oh, well, Rob began, his face falling. Do you not bring it to mind? She was at our wedding, aye. She was at Kelder for a day or two, you ken. The old one made her swear to it just before she went to learn the living, he added, in case mentioning the wishes of the last Kelder would deflect whatever storm was coming. As well to keep an eye on her, you couldn't beat her, I don't know. Rob anybody's voice trailed away in the face of Gianni's look. It's true, Kelder has to marry the big man, said Ginny, just like I married ye. Rob anybody feel, am I not a good wife to thee? Oh, fine, Rob burbled, but you cannot be married to two wives, because that would be bigamy, wouldn't it not? Said Gianni, her voice dangerously sweet. Ach, it wasn't that big, said Rob anybody, desperately looking around for a way of escape, and it was only temporary, but she's lost, and she was good at thinking. I'm good at thinking, Rob anybody, and I'm a Kelda or this clan, and I'm not. Can only be one, is that not so? And I'm thinking that there will be no more chasing after this big wee girl. Shame on ye, anyway, she will not like the big Yana gobbing at her all the time, I'm sure. Rob anybody hung his head. Aye, but, he said, but what? A hiver's chasing the poor wee lass. There was a long pause before Jeannie said, Are you sure? I killed us, said Big Jan. Once you hear that buzzing, you never forget it. Gianni bit her lip, and then looking a little pale, she said, You said she got a makings of her powerful hag, Rob. Aye, but not one in history have survived the hiver. You can kill it. And stop it, but you cannot. But you was not telling me how the big wee girl even fought the queen in one, said Gianni. Winged her with a skillet, you said. That means she's good, aye. She's a true hag. She'll find a way herself. We all have to do her weird. Whatever's out there, she's got to face it. If she cannot, she's not a true hag. Aye, but a hiver's worse, Rob began. She's always to learn haggling from the other hags, said Jenny, and I must learn Kelder and all by myself. You must hope she learns as fast as me, Rob anybody.